They called it puena culae justice, sewn shut in leather. A traitor stripped naked, forced into a sack with a dog, a snake, a monkey, and a rooster. Each creature chosen not by whim, but by symbolism, rage, deceit, mockery, and chaos. The sack was bound tight, stitched shut, and hurled into the Tiber. Inside, the condemned fought not only for breath, but against the living embodiments of his own guilt. The snake bit blindly, the monkey shrieked, the dog tore at flesh, and the river swallowed all. The Roman crowd called it balance, one life erased to preserve the empire's order. This was not a secret ritual performed in darkness. It was public, recorded, and justified by law. Puena culae was reserved for parricides, those who killed their fathers. To Rome, such a crime violated nature itself. But behind this moral theatre lay something deeper, an obsession with visibility. Justice had to be seen. Suffering had to have witnesses. It was not enough to punish the guilty. The spectacle itself had to reaffirm the empire's mythology, that Rome, the most rational of civilizations, could regulate even horror with precision. Witnesses were encouraged to attend not for bloodlust, but for moral education. The emperor's message was clear. Rome's peace was maintained not by mercy, but by fear, dressed in ceremony. Philosophers later praised the punishment's symbolic coherence, admiring how the condemned perished within a miniature ecosystem of nature's vengeance. The theatre of the sack was Rome in miniature. Every element ordered, purposeful, efficient. The Republic may have died, but its obsession with discipline survived in the empire's ritual of death. So the question remains, how did Rome, the self-proclaimed light of law, build its foundation upon orchestrated pain? Was this discipline, or simply efficiency in dehumanization? They called it crucifixio, the discipline of death. Not chaos, not rage, a process. When a man was condemned, carpenters arrived first, measuring timber with the precision of engineers. The beam was planed smooth, where the back would scrape. Nails were selected not for sharpness, but for endurance iron rods, designed to penetrate bone without breaking it. The wrists, not the palms. That detail mattered. A nail through the hand would tear loose within hours. Through the wrist, it could hold the full weight of a man for days. Rome had learned this through experimentation, thousands of test subjects, each suffering adding to the empire's data set. Every crucifixion was an act of bureaucratic engineering, the management of agony for maximum visibility. The condemned were stripped naked because humiliation was part of justice. The cross was raised outside the city walls, along the main roads, where merchants, farmers, and children could pass by and learn the lesson Rome does not forget. They chose locations strategically: the hill, the highway, the marketplace. Anywhere visibility multiplied, scribes stood by with tablets recording the names, the crimes, the duration of each death. Even pain was logged, quantified, turned into precedent. Nothing was wasted. Even the flies served a purpose, reminding witnesses that divine order demanded decay. Yet, in Senate speeches, these same men spoke of virtus and disciplina, the moral pillars of civilization. They debated philosophy under marble arches, while just beyond the city's limits, human bodies became warnings fluttering in the wind. To Rome, there was no contradiction. Pain was proof of order. Mercy was disorder, a crack in the foundation. The empire called it justice. But the method revealed a deeper creed: stability at any cost. When a rebellion broke out, the legions crucified not just leaders, but every 10th man in the ranks: decimation. They called it a numerical punishment that turned cruelty into mathematics. Even morality had a formula now. The philosophers rationalized it as necessity. "Suffering preserves peace," wrote Seneca. "Discipline is the spine of the state." But what they built was a theology of pain, where the body became the parchment on which law was written. Rome's crosses lined the horizon like a forest of warnings. The condemned hung for days, their muscles trembling, lungs slowly filling with fluid until the weight of their own bodies strangled them. Soldiers would break legs to speed the process or pierce the ribs to display efficiency. To an empire that revered geometry, death itself had to be symmetrical. The smell was indescribable iron rot and incense. Priests sometimes sprinkled holy water on the dying, framing the act as purification. It wasn't cruelty, they insisted, it was order. That was Rome's brilliance, to turn atrocity into ritual, to make horror look like discipline. The cross became not just a punishment, but a symbol. The empire's spine, its geometry of fear. And so, under banners proclaiming law and virtue, Rome perfected the art of controlled agony. But as the sun set on each crucifixion hill, one question remained suspended in the air with the dying. Was this virtuous moral strength, or merely efficiency in dehumanization? Rome discovered early that fear could be refined, that pain properly staged could resemble art. The empire called it spectacle spectaculum, from the same root as spectator. Fire and iron became instruments of aesthetic control. When the condemned burned, it was not chaos, but choreography. Soldiers arranged the wood at precise angles so the flame rose evenly. The condemned was bound, not flung, his position calculated for maximum visibility from the amphitheater seats. It was not enough to kill. Rome had to sculpt the moment. Death was curated, illuminated, timed. The brazen bull was one of its masterpieces, an invention of the Sicilian tyrant Phalaris, perfected by Roman artisans. A hollow bronze statue shaped like a bull with a trapdoor on its flank. The victim was locked inside and a fire lit beneath. As the metal-heated screams echoed through pipes that transformed them into the sound of a roaring animal, artisans lined the pipes with resonating chambers to enhance tone and rhythm. To the spectators, it was performance. A divine animal enraged its cries, the price of order. To the condemned, it was slow annihilation by design. When the Emperor Nero revived the bull for public executions, poets praised the music of justice. Live burnings were theatre too. When arsonists, traitors, or rebels faced judgment, their deaths were scheduled at dusk, when shadows were long and torches glowed. The crowd's reaction mattered more than the crime. The flames reflected in 1,000 bronze helmets, turning soldiers into part of the scenery. Officials timed the moment when the condemned's knees gave out, ensuring the fall was visible from the upper tiers. The executioner's precision was admired as craftsmanship. A botched death too quick, too messy, was an insult to the audience. Rome demanded perfection even from its cruelty. In the spoliarium, the chamber beneath the arena, slaves scrubbed the remains from iron hooks, their hands raw with lye. The charred bones were weighed, sometimes sold, for ritual use. Blood drained into channels, designed like aqueducts, washing into the Tiber. Engineers calculated slope and flow, ensuring sanitation for the city that had turned death into logistics. Nothing symbolized Rome's genius more clearly the same civilization that built aqueducts for water also built drains for blood. Citizens called it justice. Philosophers called it catharsis. In the writings of Lucan and Martial, execution became metaphor purification by flame. The condemned's agony was framed as moral cleansing, evil burning itself away. Yet, the audience's pleasure betrayed the truth. The Romans had learned to blur morality with spectacle, fear with beauty. They did not cheer for justice, they cheered for control. When a man burned, Rome's order was affirmed in light and sound. The empire proved that terror could be elegant. Nero, the emperor most infamous for indulgence, understood this instinct perfectly. He staged executions like theatre with music, poetry, and scent. When Christians were condemned as arsonists after the Great Fire, he had them tied to stakes and set alight to serve as human torches in his gardens. Musicians played while senators dined. The spectacle was so precise that it impressed even his critics, the choreography of morality, the empire's darkest entertainment. Later historians would condemn Nero's excesses, but they missed the point. He was not a deviation from Rome's system. He was its perfection. The deeper horror was not in the screams, but in the applause. Pain became education, a civic duty. Children watched with their fathers, learning that justice had a scent, smoke, and iron. The crowd absorbed the empire's logic. Cruelty was proof of strength. Pity, a symptom of weakness. The arena taught them to admire endurance, to conflate survival with virtue. Victims were expected to die well silently, their stillness framed as dignity. A tremor, a scream was shameful. Rome had not only conquered nations, it had colonized emotion itself. Behind the marble facades, cruelty was method, not madness. Engineers designed instruments of pain with the same discipline used for bridges. The crux compacta, a smaller portable cross for quick executions, was standardized for military use. The fusturium, a club used to beat deserters, was calibrated for bone density. Iron hooks, pulleys, racks, each had official dimensions, ensuring uniformity across provinces. The empire that measured aqueducts in cubits also measured human suffering in hours. But cruelty, once mechanized, demanded consumption. The people grew addicted to spectacle, to the moral high that followed collective judgment. Crowds wanted novelty, new methods, new sensations. Philosophers rationalized it as moral theater, a way to teach the masses discipline. Paine said one senator is the most persuasive teacher. That was Rome's secret. It did not need to invent new punishments, only new meanings for them. Fire purified iron, disciplined spectacle unified. This was the trinity of Roman order. The same empire that built libraries to preserve wisdom also built pyres to display obedience. And in that contradiction between marble intellect and molten brutality, Rome found its balance. It believed that civilization required spectacle, that fear was the mortar holding law together. By the time dawn returned after a night of executions, ashes covered the forum like dust from a burnt offering. The city smelled faintly of oil and meat. The crowd dispersed, cleansed by what they had witnessed. In temples, priests performed prayers for justice, their voices echoing against the marble where the cries had faded. Rome called it peace. But beneath the silence, something darker endured, a belief that the spectacle itself was sacred. And so the question sharpened: when cruelty is performed with beauty, when terror is aesthetic, can a society still recognize evil, or has it turned into art? No empire survives on chaos. Rome's brutality worked because it was procedural. Every act of torture, every execution, every broken body passed through the same invisible machinery, the bureaucracy of law. Behind each lash or crucifixion stood the scriba, the praeco, the quaestor clerks, announcers, accountants, turning suffering into paperwork. The Romans called it ordo order, sequence method. Pain was not wild. It was documented, filed, and taxed. In the marble halls of the Forum, judgment was not shouted, it was written. The judge pronounced guilt, but the scriba made it real by scratching the decree into wax tablets. Those tablets travelled from hand to hand, one to the prison warden, one to the treasurer, one to the archive. Bureaucracy was Rome's true instrument of domination, more efficient than swords. The condemned became an entry in the empire's ledger, his name, his crime, his value to the state. Even death had a receipt. Under the law, testimony from slaves was admissible only if obtained by torture. Jurists justified it as logic. A slave's words spoken freely could not be trusted, because the slave had no persona, no legal self. Pain, they argued, compelled truth. The whip was not cruelty, it was authentication. Scribes recorded every confession with the same tone used for market contracts, noting which instruments were used, which limbs were bound. Justice in Rome was an experiment in anatomy. The courtroom became a theatre of silence. The magistrate sat elevated, surrounded by clerks in crimson-bordered togas. Chains rattled as defendants were brought forward, their feet brushing the marble floor polished by centuries of tears. The audience did not shout. They observed. This was not entertainment. It was governance. A judgment scroll might bear 10 signatures, one for the verdict, another for the execution warrant, another for the property transfer, once the condemned's estate was seized. Even cruelty generated paperwork, and paperwork meant accountability to the system, not the soul. Pain passed through channels. The executioner did not choose who died. The clerk did not swing the lash. The judge did not hear the screams. Each functionary obeyed his role, insulated by hierarchy. It was moral fragmentation perfected. Everyone participated. No one felt responsible. This is how empires cleanse conscience through process. Cicero himself, the paragon of Roman justice, defended this logic in the courts. The law must be terrible to the wicked, he declared, so that the good may rest. But wicked in Rome was elastic. It could mean rebel debtor foreigner, or simply inconvenient. And so, the machinery of law expanded, lubricated by precision and obedience. Torture chambers were placed beneath courthouses not for secrecy, but proximity. The sounds of suffering were the hum of administration. The record of one slave, Attalus, survives on a fragment of wax found near Pompeii, confessed under lash. Property of Gaius Lentulus. Delivered to crucifixion site South Road. The handwriting is beautiful, elegant, practiced. A civil servant's pride in good penmanship. That neat script outlived both victim and master. The cruelty became data archived in a vault that would survive the eruption, the centuries, the silence. Rome's genius was not only to kill, but to preserve its logic of killing. The imperial governors enforced quotas for interrogation outcomes. A province that produced too few confessions could face inquiry. Torture became not proof, but productivity. Officials competed in efficiency. Some boasted of extracting truth in half the usual time. Others refined instruments, rotating racks, calibrated pulleys to minimize waste. The result was a perfect illusion. Every scream had a form, every death a document, every cruelty a clause. Philosophers like Seneca tried to reconcile this machinery with virtue. They called it ratio doloris, the reason of pain. To them, the state must discipline the flesh so that the soul may remain pure. Yet beneath the rhetoric of balance and justice lay an empire that had turned agony into administration. Even rebellion fed the bureaucracy. When Spartacus's uprising was crushed, the paperwork alone took weeks. 6,600 crucifixions along the Appian Way required 78 scrolls of parchment, a special committee for lumber requisition, and thousands of signatures. The horror was logistical. Officials debated where to space the crosses, how to prevent the stench from reaching the villas, how to calculate expenses. Each corpse a data point in the empire's moral equation. What made Rome indestructible was not its armies. It was this machinery, the belief that law could sanctify anything. If cruelty bore the imperial seal, it ceased to be cruelty. It became order civic duty progress. And in that bureaucratic sanctity, the human disappeared. Every empire since has borrowed this pattern forms, replacing conscience signatures, replacing guilt. Rome did not invent evil, it organized it. But a question begins to rise beneath the marble calm when cruelty is legalized, when every horror has a line in the ledger. Does anyone remain guilty, or does the law itself become the executioner? The Colosseum was not just a monument to spectacle, it was an industry. Every drop of blood spilled there circulated through Rome's veins like coin through a market. Behind the cheers and dust, a vast logistical machine managed the flow of bodies, contracts, and profits. The empire's violence was not random, it was monetized. Gladiators were inventory death, a business model, and suffering an asset class that paid dividends in applause and loyalty. Before a single fight began, hundreds of transactions had already taken place. Trainers known as Lannistai purchased slaves and prisoners in bulk from state auctions, each tagged with their age, strength, and potential resale value. Armorers supplied helmets, shields, and swords calibrated to prolong combat, not end it. Physicians stood ready not to heal, but to repair gladiators just enough to make them fight again. And the state itself collected taxes on every transaction, every ticket, every corpse. The ledger of the arena was a masterpiece of imperial economics. A day at the games could generate more wealth than a provincial harvest. Merchants sold oil, wine, and meat. Artisans carved miniatures of famous fighters. Gamblers placed wagers on who would die fastest. The emperor's treasury often subsidized the spectacle not as charity, but as psychological investment. Bread and circuses, as Juvenal wrote, were cheaper than revolt. The crowd fed and entertained, learned to equate obedience with privilege. The more efficiently the games ran, the more stable the empire seemed. And yet behind this efficiency lay a disturbing truth. Cruelty was profitable because it was predictable. Each gladiator's life was insured through informal contracts. If one died too soon, another could be supplied from a nearby ludus. Bodies were not wasted, they were recycled. Blood scraped from the sand was rumored to cure epilepsy, charred bones sold as medicine. The skin of beasts that killed men became luxury rugs. Even the remains of the dead were folded back into the economy. The Roman genius was not invention, it was extraction. Rome's philosophers liked to frame this system as the harmony of order. They said the games reflected the cosmos' strength, rewarded weakness, destroyed. But beneath that veneer of divine justice lay a mechanical process where human agony was transformed into civic profit. The accountants of the arena calculated risk and return with the same detachment as modern bankers. How many lions per man? How many hours per execution? Efficiency masked barbarity. To be a lanista, a manager of gladiators, was to stand at the moral intersection of commerce and cruelty. These men negotiated like merchants and ruled like generals. A skilled fighter could be trained for months, costing hundreds of denarii. To lose him early was bad business. So, trainers developed methods to calibrate violence wounds deep enough to excite the audience, but rarely fatal in the first act. The illusion of freedom, the dance of risk, it was theatre written in blood. Even the state's laws bent to serve this market. During Emperor Domitian's reign, new edicts required provinces to contribute not taxes, but bodies, criminals, slaves, and prisoners to replenish the arenas. The more distant the province, the higher the symbolic value of its captives. Each shipment of men from Gaul or Dacia represented Rome's global reach conquest turned into entertainment. The games became annual audits of empire, proof that Rome could kill anywhere and anyone on schedule. The poets called it glory. But beneath the marble seats, the slave tunnels told another story. Archaeologists have found inscriptions scratched into the walls. He was my brother. We fought on the same day. Small, desperate testaments to individuality, etched where no patrician would ever look. The audience saw only the surface, sand-blood triumph. The empire saw balance sheets. Only the condemned remembered that every cheer above was built on someone's silence below. And still the crowd adored it. The spectacle erased empathy, replacing pity with pride. Ordinary citizens whose own lives were ruled by debt and decree found release in witnessing sanctioned suffering. Watching a man die for disobedience reaffirmed their own survival. It was the perfect exchange, fear converted into entertainment. The people became both customer and accomplice. Rome did not hide its violence, it sold it as virtue. When a gladiator saluted the emperor with Ave Caesar morituri te salutant Hail Caesar, those who are about to die salute you. He was not expressing loyalty. He was acknowledging the system, the cycle of purchase, pain, and applause that defined the empire's morality. Death was not an end. It was an invoice paid in spectacle. Even today, the ruins of the Colosseum whisper that arithmetic. 50,000 seats, 80 entrances, thousands of deaths per decade, each one a number in a forgotten economy of control. Rome taught the world that power does not need to hide its cruelty if it can brand it as entertainment. But beneath the roar of the crowd, another question remains unresolved. When a civilization learns to profit from suffering, can it still tell the difference between justice and hunger? The arena was never merely a place of punishment. It was the empire's classroom. Here, Rome taught its citizens not only what justice looked like, but what obedience felt like. The crowd was not an audience to violence. It was a participant in it, an accomplice, disguised as a spectator. In every cheer, every chant, the empire tested and reinforced its control. The theatre of blood was not about killing criminals. It was about rehearsing submission. Morning began with the executions. Criminals, deserters, and rebels, bound half naked, were dragged across the sand to the jeers of tens of thousands. Their deaths were scripted by profession arsonists burned alive. Murderers stabbed by actors dressed as mythic heroes, thieves mauled by beasts named for gods. The public believed these were moral lessons, justice rendered before their eyes. But in truth, they were rehearsals in power psychology. The spectators learned what happened when Rome was disobeyed. The condemned learned it too late. At midday, the executions paused for lunch. Vendors filled the aisles selling wine fruit and salted nuts. Children reenacted mock duels with wooden swords. The line between festival and execution blurred completely. To the empire, that was the point. The normalization of cruelty was the greatest triumph of all. When laughter and death occupied the same hour, Rome knew it had succeeded in merging morality with entertainment. To be Roman meant to consume violence with a clean conscience. As the afternoon games began, the spectacle evolved from punishment into performance. Gladiators fought in pairs, then in teams, their names shouted by the crowd like today's athletes. The people had favorites champions whose likeness appeared on clay lamps and tavern walls. Rome's rulers understood the genius of this psychology. Loyalty could be redirected. Instead of resenting senators or emperors, citizens worshipped those who killed and died in their name. Emotion had replaced ethics. Identity replaced inquiry. But the audience's complicity ran deeper. The emperor sat in the imperial box, watching not only the fighters but the faces of his subjects. Every cheer was data proof that the people accepted pain as spectacle. When the crowd demanded death with a downward thumb, they became Rome's enforcers. The decision to spare or slay was no longer divine. It was democratic violence approved by the masses. No empire in history had found a more efficient way to unite control and consent. The games were designed for visibility but also for hierarchy. The poorest sat at the top, distant from the sand, but still engulfed in awe. Below them, citizens, soldiers, priests, and magistrates each occupied their assigned rows, a physical manifestation of Rome's order. The emperor's seat formed the axis of this world, a god among mortals. Architecture itself taught obedience. Every glance reminded you of your place. The arena was Rome's miniature cosmos, with power radiating from the center and submission arranged in perfect symmetry. And yet, even among the audience, there were whispers. Philosophers like Seneca and Epictetus condemned the games as moral decay. Seneca once wrote after attending, "The cruelty has become a craving. What was once punishment has turned to pleasure." But his words, like the cries of the dying, were drowned by applause. The empire did not censor dissent, it smothered it in noise. Spectacle became insulation. When everyone cheers who dares to question. The power of the games lay not just in fear, but in participation. Citizens were rewarded for attending, praised for loyalty, and taxed to fund the shows. To be absent was suspicious. To protest was treasonous. The empire no longer needed secret police when it had public consensus. Fear had evolved into ritual. By turning cruelty into celebration, Rome engineered the most enduring form of control: voluntary complicity. Even children were indoctrinated early. Wooden gladiator toys, miniature arenas, and heroic murals turned violence into play. The next generation learned empathy as weakness, spectacle as duty. Rome didn't just kill rebels, it trained obedience into bloodlines. Every roar of the crowd was a baptism into the cult of control. By the time the final fight of the day arrived, exhaustion and exhilaration merged into one emotion: catharsis. The emperor would rise, raise his hand, and the crowd would fall silent. A single gesture decided a man's fate. The collective breath of 50,000 people held by one hand, that was the true triumph of the games. Not the death below, but the silence above. Rome had learned to choreograph the human soul. When the last corpse was dragged away and the sand raked smooth, the illusion was complete. Citizens left the arena believing they had witnessed justice. In reality, they had practiced obedience. The games were not about cruelty. They were about control, through spectacle, emotion, as enforcement. Rome discovered what every power after it would inherit: that terror, when performed beautifully, does not repel it, fascinates. And as the crowd poured back into the streets, one question lingered in the air like dust over the arena. When a people learn to cheer for death, can they still recognize their own chains? The empire never confessed to cruelty, it sanctified it. Every lash, every crucifixion, every burning body was justified not as punishment, but as purification. Rome turned horror into ritual violence, into virtue. It wasn't enough to control the body. The mind had to believe the whip was divine. That was Rome's true innovation. It didn't hide its brutality. It baptized it. From the Senate's marble floors to the temple altars, the rhetoric was the same. Justice was sacred because it mirrored the gods. Jupiter punished the rebellious Titans. Mars demanded blood for order. And Saturn the Devourer symbolized the necessary cycle of destruction that sustained life. What Rome did to its criminals, its philosophers said, the gods had always done to humanity. Violence became cosmic symmetry, not moral failure. To question that logic was to challenge heaven itself. Priests officiated executions as if conducting ceremonies. Before certain public killings, incense burned, prayers were offered, and auguries read. The condemned were dressed not as criminals, but as sacrifices. The crowd was told that their suffering pleased the gods, restored balance, and washed away corruption. This was theology as propaganda, a divine laundering of human cruelty. If the gods demanded order, then pain was obedience. If the emperor ruled by divine mandate, then mercy could even be blasphemy. Philosophers joined in. Seneca, the younger tutor to Nero, wrote that suffering disciplines the soul and tests the virtue of men. The Stoics, whose creed celebrated endurance, gave the empire the moral vocabulary it needed. Stoicism told citizens that pain was noble, that submission was strength, that to endure without protest was to imitate gods themselves. Under this philosophy, slaves learned silence, soldiers learned obedience, and citizens learned complicity. The empire had found its perfect moral anesthetic. Every civilization needs a story to explain its cruelty. And Rome wrote its own in marble and myth. The myths of Ganymede, Mars, and the she-wolf taught that domination was divine design. Art reinforced the message frescoes of chained figures pleading before serene gods decorated public baths and villas. Beauty masked atrocity. The closer one looked, the more one saw the empire's moral logic hidden in its art. A logic that whispered, suffering is order, power is sacred. But perhaps the most chilling union between faith and punishment lay in the temples themselves. Some temples served double duty as courts. Trials took place beneath towering columns, with priests presiding as both legal and spiritual judges. The accused knelt under shafts of light pouring through the roof, their bodies framed like offerings on an altar. Architecture amplified guilt. Sunlight and stone worked as instruments of submission. The condemned were forced to look upward. As they were sentenced, their eyes filled with divine imagery, proof that judgment came from the heavens, not from men. Even death was structured to mimic religious ritual. Crucifixions aligned with holy days, executions timed with festivals, so that punishment merged with celebration. It was not cruelty, it was spectacle in service of faith. The people believed they were witnessing divine justice, when in truth they were absorbing imperial doctrine. The gods required blood, the emperor merely delivered it. And so faith and fear became indistinguishable. Yet, not all believed. Some early philosophers, even Roman poets, sensed the contradiction. Ovid, exiled for his verses, hinted in his poetry that Rome's gods were merely masks for tyranny. What we call holy, he wrote, is only what the strong demand. But his voice, like so many, vanished into the silence of empire. Rome's theology didn't need to silence dissent. It drowned it in grandeur. The same temples that echoed with hymns also absorbed the screams of the condemned. Over time, even religion itself became a form of torture. Enemies of the state were executed in temples so their death might be sanctified as divine vengeance. Fires were lit in the names of gods. Blood flowed into the cracks of marble floors once meant for worship. Faith became function. The gods no longer existed to inspire hope. They existed to justify the emperor's will. This was Rome's genius. It turned fear into faith. No one needed to believe in cruelty when cruelty was made holy. The sacred excuse outlasted the blood it concealed. Even centuries later, when Christianity replaced Jupiter with Christ, the structure remained the same. Redemption through pain, obedience through sacrifice. Rome had built a system so perfect that even its moral replacements kept its bones. The sacred excuse made every cruelty lawful, every wound necessary, every scream meaningful. And once violence wears the mask of virtue, it can never again be seen for what it is. So the question remains, if the gods bless the whip who dares to call it evil? Rome's cruelty spared no one, not even those who had once enforced it. The empire devoured its own hierarchy with the same efficiency it used on slaves and criminals. The senators who signed execution orders, the generals who supervised mass crucifixions, the nobles who toasted beneath marble domes, they all lived under the same sword. For in a system built on fear, no one is ever safe. When power depends on public terror, loyalty becomes fragile currency. One rumor, one whisper of conspiracy could turn a decorated consul into a traitor by morning. The same law that punished slaves for theft could condemn a senator for thought. Accusations became political weapons, trials became performances. Even in the Senate, witnesses were coerced evidence, fabricated verdicts predetermined. Torture once reserved for the lowborn now climbed the social ladder. Those who had ordered others flogged found themselves stretched on the rack, listening to their joints pop like the very slaves they once commanded. Take the case of Lucius Sejanus, once the most powerful man in Rome under Emperor Tiberius. Sejanus controlled the Praetorian Guard, the emperor's personal army, and for years ruled in all but name. But when suspicion arose that his ambition reached too high, the machinery he built turned against him. He was arrested during a Senate session, dragged through the streets, and executed within hours. His children were killed beside him, their bodies left in the forum as warnings. The mob that had once shouted his praises now tore at his corpse. Rome did not kill rebellion, it recycled it, turning yesterday's servant into today's example. Even emperors learned that divine titles offered no immunity. Caligula was butchered by his own guards. Nero declared an enemy of the state fled and committed suicide before public execution could claim him. Each death followed a ritual script, swift, humiliating public. Their bodies became symbols, their names cautionary myths. The empire sustained itself not by loyalty, but by fear, renewed in every generation. A senator's downfall was more instructive than a slave's proof that the law had no favorites, that even power must kneel before power. Roman elites lived within invisible cages of ceremony and suspicion. Every triumph risked becoming evidence of treason. Every feast could end in an accusation, whispered over wine. Senators learned to perform humility, to praise emperors in speeches laced with terror. The same audience that roared in the arenas hungered for aristocratic blood in marble halls. Public execution was Rome's favorite equalizer. It reminded everyone that grandeur was conditional. The paradox was exquisite. The empire that exalted law also weaponized it. Trials were theater verdicts, predetermined confessions extracted under duress. In Nero's reign, condemned nobles were forced to open their own veins, their death staged as voluntary sacrifices to the state. Philosophy became choreography. Dying with composure was the final proof of Roman discipline. The body became the stage for submission, the final offering to an empire that demanded not belief, but performance. Even those spared execution lived in constant rehearsal for it. The Senate chamber itself was designed for surveillance-raised tiers, allowed every senator to watch every other face, every tremor of fear. The architecture of power doubled as the architecture of paranoia. To serve Rome was to play an endless role in a drama where applause could turn to condemnation in a single gesture. This was not chaos, it was governance by dread. When no one could predict who would fall next, obedience became instinct. Elites competed not for freedom, but for proximity to danger. To dine with the emperor was both honor and hazard. Each smile at court might be the last. And yet, they smiled because in Rome, survival required complicity. The empire had engineered a perfect feedback loop. Fear produced loyalty. Loyalty preserved fear. Even rebellions served the system, for each crushed plot justified new purges, new laws, new spectacles. The execution of a noble was not merely punishment, it was reassurance. It reminded the people that the empire was impartial, that divinity demanded equality in terror. There were no martyrs, only examples. When Nero forced his tutor Seneca to commit suicide, the philosopher's calm death became propaganda. A demonstration of Roman stoicism twisted into an endorsement of imperial justice. The elite's agony was moral theater transforming brutality into philosophy. Rome did not destroy its intellectual class, it used their deaths to decorate its own conscience. By the 2nd century, the empire's cruelty had become so systematized that even privilege was indistinguishable from peril. Senators built their tombs early, sculpted their own epitaphs, and bribed historians to write favorable deaths. They knew that in a society where power itself was punishment, the only safe victory was to die on script. Because in Rome, every rise foretold a fall, and every fall was another lesson in obedience. So the question becomes, if tyranny devours its own nobility, does it ever truly end, or does it simply feed on new flesh? Rome did not think of cruelty as chaos. It thought of it as arithmetic. Everything from the lash on a slave's back to the beheading of a senator was accounted for. Pain was not emotion, but transaction. The empire turned suffering into a system, one measured in property, productivity, and prestige. In marble archives beneath the Forum, scribes inked names beside crimes, punishments, beside costs, damages, beside restitution. Every agony had a column. Every death had a price. This was the empire's genius and its sickness. It translated morality into bookkeeping. A slave's broken bones were logged as loss of labor value. The torture of a criminal was listed as judicial expense. When a noble fell from favor, the confiscation of his estate balanced the treasury's ledger. Rome called this justice. The gods, the Senate, the accountants all agreed that order required balance, and balance demanded blood. In its ledgers, law and economy became indistinguishable. A crucifixion could be justified as crowd management, a public burning as deterrence expenditure. Bureaucrats stamped approval on torture the way merchants approved cargo lists. The executioner was an instrument of state finance as much as morality. The empire did not merely tolerate violence, it audited it. The ledger extended beyond the living. Even in death, Rome kept score. Estates of the executed were sold to fund new arenas. The taxes collected on spectacle fed the city's grain supply. The games that drained human life also filled bellies. Citizens ate bread bought with the blood of their neighbors and called it civilization. There was no contradiction in their minds, only efficiency. Rome had made morality measurable. This precision was what made its cruelty enduring. A mob's rage fades, but bureaucracy remembers. A whip strike could vanish in a heartbeat, but an entry on papyrus could outlast empires. Rome's archives were its conscience cold, methodical, eternal. Generations later, archaeologists would unearth fragments of these records, a receipt for a slave's execution fee, an itemized bill for oil used in a burning, an account of timber requisitioned for crosses. The empire's humanity survives only through its accounting. But beneath this administrative calm lay an unbearable paradox. The same law that promised equality before the gods turned suffering into capital. Justice became logistics. Mercy became inefficiency. Every reformer who tried to humanize the system was forced to speak its language, to argue that leniency was cheaper, that compassion cost less than cruelty. Morality itself had to be justified in terms of budget. Rome's greatest philosophers from Seneca to Marcus Aurelius wrote of virtue reason and self-control. Yet, their words floated above a society that weaponized those very ideals. Virtus, the Roman moral of strength, was not about justice. It was about endurance. To suffer well was to serve the empire. The crucified man, the condemned senator, the whipped slave, all performed their role in proving Rome's balance sheet of order. And perhaps that was the true brilliance of the Roman system. It made complicity feel rational. Citizens did not see themselves as cruel. They saw themselves as administrators of stability. The whip was not punishment, it was correction. The arena was not bloodlust, it was duty. The ledger was not sin, it was governance. Even religion conformed to the same logic. Offerings to the gods were calculated in coin and carcass. Sacrifice like punishment had to match the magnitude of the offense. The empire built temples and amphitheaters from the same stone, funded by the same taxes, animated by the same belief that harmony required human cost. It is easy to see Rome's cruelty as ancient alien, but the closer we look, the more familiar its structure becomes. We still keep ledgers, economic growth beside environmental collapse, corporate profit beside human exhaustion, stability beside silence. We too convert suffering into numbers, justify harm as necessity, and call the result progress. The Roman ledger never closed, it merely changed columns. The ink dried, but the logic survived. So here the open question hangs: if civilization keeps its books in blood, can it ever truly balance them? Rome's cruelty was not born from rage, it was engineered from thought. Beneath the spectacle, beneath the roars of the arena and the bureaucratic precision of the courts, lay a philosophy. Control is the purest form of order. To govern millions scattered across deserts, mountains, and seas, the empire did not rely on love or loyalty. It relied on fear, organized, sanctified, rationalized fear. The emperors understood that fear could not remain wild. It had to be tamed, shaped, and institutionalized. That was the purpose of Roman justice, not to punish the guilty, but to remind the innocent. Law became the stage upon which obedience was taught, not tested. Each execution, each public humiliation, each whispered verdict under marble arches was a lesson in submission. Philosophers dressed this truth in language that sounded noble. Seneca spoke of discipline, Marcus Aurelius of duty. Cicero praised law as the highest virtue of civilization. Yet, every word concealed the same unspoken assumption: order was more important than mercy. The state was not a community. It was a hierarchy of obedience. Rome conquered not through sword alone, but through the internalization of power. Citizens learned to police themselves long before soldiers needed to intervene. And so, punishment became pedagogy. The arena was a school, the scaffold a lecture hall. Citizens watched as criminals were flayed, burned, or crucified, and they learned the price of defiance. The message was never about crime, it was about consequence. Rome's moral code was performance art, violence, rehearsed to perfection, agony, choreographed to inspire gratitude. When the condemned screamed, the empire reminded the crowd that silence was safety. This was Rome's genius. It made control invisible. No one felt enslaved, they felt protected. No one called it fear, they called it order. The law became a kind of theology, a ritual of purification that promised peace in exchange for submission. Every class, from patricians to slaves, was taught its place in this cosmic hierarchy. To challenge authority was to disrupt the divine. To obey was to become part of the eternal machine. Control was not enforced by cruelty alone, it was maintained through participation. The Roman people became the empire's co-conspirators. They built the arenas funded, the games demanded, the spectacles. Every cheer was an act of complicity, every silence a form of consent. They did not simply witness power, they enacted it. and so cruelty ceased to look like violence. It looked like duty ceremony, even beauty. The marble of the Colosseum glowed in the sunlight, its arches perfect, its geometry divine. Visitors from distant provinces marveled at the architecture, not realizing they were standing inside a monument to systematized control. This was no mere amphitheater. It was the philosophy of the empire made visible: symmetry, order, discipline, hierarchy. The physical perfection of the building mirrored the moral perfection Rome imagined for itself. Inside those walls, the crowd was both spectator and subject. As thousands screamed for death, they were reaffirming their own subjugation. The emperor seated above them all became the embodiment of law and mercy. With a simple gesture of the thumb, he decided who would live and who would die. The people called it entertainment, but it was theology. The emperor's authority was divine, precisely because it could choose to spare or to destroy. Every empire that followed would inherit this insight that control endures only when it becomes ritual, when domination feels sacred. The church would later replace the arena with the pulpit, the Colosseum with cathedrals, the whip with confession. But the architecture of fear remained. Even now, the same principle governs modern systems of power. Governments, corporations, and institutions do not demand love. They cultivate obedience through structure. Surveillance cameras replace centurions. Algorithms replace ledgers. Social approval replaces imperial decree. We obey not because we are forced to, but because we are trained to believe that obedience equals safety. This is the final evolution of Rome's philosophy, the control of bodies replaced by the control of minds. The empire no longer needs iron or flame. It only needs belief. The question that Rome leaves behind is not how it conquered the world, but how it persuaded the conquered to call their submission peace. History remembers the victors. Rome ensured that. Statues immortalized generals, senators, and philosophers, but never the condemned. The empire that carved its laws in stone erased the names of those crushed beneath them. For every orator who spoke of justice, there were thousands whose voices were silenced forever, not by death alone, but by deliberate omission. Their absence was Rome's most efficient form of power to destroy not only the body, but the record that it ever existed. Archaeologists today find traces of those who were never meant to be found. Unmarked graves outside city walls, shackles buried in volcanic ash bones, bent unnaturally from crucifixion. The soil of Rome's provinces has become the archive that its historians refused to write. Beneath every villa and forum, under every road paved by conquest, lie the remains of those who built and bled for the glory above. Their names are gone, but their presence refuses to disappear. Sometimes a single graffito, a scratched plea in a prison wall, outlives the emperor who ordered its erasure. A slave's initials carved into amphitheater seating. A woman's curse written on pottery before her execution. These fragments speak louder than scrolls because they were never meant to survive. They reveal what official records conceal, that Rome's perfection was built upon systematic forgetting. The Romans had a word for it: damnatio memoriae, the condemnation of memory. To be erased was a punishment reserved for the most dangerous offenders, traitors, rebels, or anyone whose existence embarrassed the state. But, in practice, the policy extended to all inconvenient lives. When a general fell from favor, his name was chiseled from triumphal arches. When a slave rebelled, his lineage was expunged from birth registries. Even families learned to self-censor to pretend their disgraced kin had never lived. Forgetting became patriotic. Yet, there is irony in erasure. It leaves an outline. The empty space where a name once stood becomes a scar in history's face. Modern historians can trace power's cruelty not by what remains, but by what is missing. Every blank inscription, every unmarked tomb, every gap in the record is proof of an empire terrified of memory. The deeper question is philosophical. Can justice exist in a world built on forgetting? Rome's success depended on selective memory, celebrating virtue while suppressing consequence. The Colosseum still stands admired as architecture, while few remember it as a cemetery of the unrecorded. Tourists marvel at the engineering, unaware that the concrete mix they photograph once absorbed blood. The stones are silent, but not innocent. Archaeology has become the resistance Rome never imagined. Shards of amphorae inscriptions and bone patterns speak what literature refused to say. Science has become the new historian of pain. DNA analysis uncovers origins of gladiators buried together, showing men from Gaul, Thrace, Syria. Foreigners turned spectacle. Strontium isotopes trace their diet, proving systemic malnutrition. The data confirms what poets denied: the empire's greatness was purchased with global suffering. This silence was not unique to Rome, it was the prototype. Later empires perfected the method. Colonial powers would erase native languages. Totalitarian regimes would vanish dissidents. Corporations would bury environmental crimes under polished branding. The logic remains identical: to control the present, one must curate the past. But erasure is never complete. Memory survives through matter. The amphitheater's tunnels still echo. The shackles rust, but their shape persists. Even the absence of names becomes testimony. The invisible victims continue to haunt the modern imagination, not as ghosts, but as questions. Who decided which lives were worth remembering? Who benefits from forgetting? Perhaps this is why ruins are more honest than chronicles. They do not speak in words, they accuse through silence. When the marble crumbles and the ink fades, what remains is the architecture of cruelty, an empire's subconscious exposed in stone. To study Rome is to confront a paradox, a civilization that worshipped eternity, yet ensured its victims vanished from it. The empire immortalized its emperors in bronze, but denied its captives even dust. And yet the captives endure through archaeology, through the faint echo of chisels that once scraped names away, through the realization that history's clean lines are drawn over bones. The invisible victims are not lost. They are simply waiting for us to look down instead of up, for us to read the ground instead of broad of the monuments. For in the soil beneath Rome's splendor lies its true archive, one, written not in Latin, but in pain. Empires do not die, they mutate. Rome's flesh rotted away 2 millennia ago, but its mind, the logic of control through spectacle, still lives in the institutions that claim to have surpassed it. We no longer nail men to wooden beams or throw traitors into sacks with serpents. We have found subtler tools: cameras, contracts, algorithms, markets. The theatre has changed its decor, but the choreography remains. Civilization didn't end cruelty, it perfected it. The Roman arena was the prototype of the modern screen, a place where violence could be moralized, sanitized, and monetized. The citizens who filled the Colosseum's tiers were not monsters. They were participants in a collective illusion that cruelty, when organized, became justice. Today's audiences scroll rather than cheer, but the reflex is identical. The humiliation of others, televised or viral, still feeds the hunger for order disguised as entertainment. Every outrage, every fall from grace, becomes another public sacrifice that reaffirms the spectator's innocence. Rome discovered that visibility itself was power. To be seen was to exist under law. To disappear was to be erased by it. Modernity inherited both sides of that equation. The slave market has evolved into a data market. Surveillance economies turn human behavior into measurable profit, as Roman accountants once tallied slaves, gladiators, and victims. The ledger never stopped, only its language changed. What was once written in wax tablets and bronze edicts is now encrypted in servers and corporate policy. The empire's cruelty became code. But the mechanism is identical humiliation as social discipline. In ancient Rome, the condemned were paraded through the forum to instruct the crowd. Today, a public figure is digitally destroyed to remind others of the cost of dissent. The medium shifted from sand to silicon, yet the moral principle remained untouched. Shame as spectacle, punishment as participation. Rome perfected psychological warfare long before the internet gave it infinite reach. Even the architecture survived, repurposed. The amphitheater became the model for stadiums, the courthouse, the news studio. Curved tiers controlled light, an elevated stage, all designed to isolate the performer and merge the audience into one obedient mass. Rome understood something we still refuse to admit. Cruelty is easier to sustain when it feels communal. The crowd's roar absolves the individual. That is how civilizations commit atrocities while believing they uphold order. And then there is the law. Roman jurisprudence taught that a slave was a res a thing. Property could be loved, used, or destroyed without moral contradiction. This ancient classification still echoes in modern economic systems that reduce people to productivity metrics, assets, liabilities. The cruelty is not visible because it is quantified. When efficiency replaces empathy, the philosophy of the cross returns only now expressed in spreadsheets, not nails. The empire's discipline became management science. Rome's true immortality lies in this abstraction of violence. The spectacle no longer needs blood. It thrives on obedience. Bureaucracies inflict despair, not with whips, but with processes, endless forms denials, and automated replies that replicate the humiliation of standing before a Roman magistrate. The empire's genius was to turn pain into paperwork, and the modern world has perfected that ritual. Every signature is a miniature crucifixion, each click an unseen chain. Even religion could not escape the contagion. The image of the cross, once an instrument of state terror, became the most recognized symbol on earth. A transformation so complete that its horror is now beauty. Rome's tool of domination became humanity's emblem of redemption. No propaganda department could invent such alchemy. The empire's machinery outlived its engineers, turning torture into theology empire, into eternity. But perhaps the most haunting legacy is psychological. Rome trained its citizens to admire power and despise weakness, to see suffering not as tragedy, but as proof of divine or moral failure. That reflex still governs the modern world. We glorify resilience while scorning vulnerability. We call exploitation ambition, inequality efficiency, and conquest progress. The Roman mind, fossilized in marble, continues to think through us. Even our ruins imitate theirs. Corporate headquarters rise where temples once stood. Wars are waged not for territory, but for attention. The global economy rewards those who can turn pain into spectacle, be it through media politics or war. The empire's grammar of control is alive in every slogan, every leaderboard, every algorithm that decides who is seen and who is silenced. The technology has advanced, but the intention remains to choreograph obedience through fear of exclusion. The question then is not whether we have escaped Rome, but whether we have ever wanted to. The empire offered something irresistible, a moral order that justified cruelty as civilization. Its citizens believed they were the guardians of progress, even as they applauded death. Are we any different when we watch suffering on our screens framed as justice or entertainment and call it awareness? In the end, Rome's greatest invention was not law or architecture. It was the myth of innocence, the belief that cruelty, when ritualized, is necessary for stability. Every empire that followed has inherited that myth. The guillotine was its Enlightenment version, the concentration camp, its industrial one, the algorithm, its digital form. The tools evolve, the philosophy persists order, must be purchased with pain and power, must never appear cruel, even when it is. What Rome began on the stones of the Forum continues in the circuitry of the modern state. The same logic flows through time. The spectacle of punishment to enforce silence, the spectacle of justice to disguise power. Civilization does not progress, it rehearses. Every empire thinks it is different, and every empire proves it is not. When we gaze upon the ruins of the Colosseum, we see only stone. But beneath those arches lies a blueprint, a system so elegant in its brutality that it transcended time. It became the skeleton of the modern world law, as theatre cruelty, as order, spectacle, as control. The empire never ended. It was absorbed. And yet even in that perfection of domination, something resists. The bones unearthed beneath Rome still speak not in words, but in silence too heavy to ignore. They remind us that systems forget, but matter remembers. That every ledger of power, no matter how complete, ends where the ground begins. When the ledgers close, the bones still speak.